Hey everybody, I'm Nathan Brown. I'm the event director here with FCP Euro, and today we're here to talk about the Mk7 GTI and the suspension. We're going to go over kind of the basics, the layout, the design of the front and the rear, and then later on we're going to get into breaking down some of the components, looking at some of the common problems or complaints that you might have, and then also looking into some of the solutions, whether it's new OE parts or aftermarket replacements. The GTI is based on the MKV platform, and it's very similar to a lot of the later generation Volkswagens that you'll see on the market from around 2006 up. It has a McPherson strut front design that's pretty common in most Volkswagens, or actually all Volkswagens, from around 1974 when the Rabbit was introduced, all the way up to current day product has a McPherson strut front design. In the rear, the Mk7 GTI has a multi-link rear suspension, so it has some advantages over the McPherson in terms of some adjustment, but each one kind of has its own pluses and minuses, and when we go into some of the detail on that, you'll probably see why Volkswagen chose to use the McPherson design up front and then the multi-link in the rear. So probably the weakest link or the most common complaint on a McPherson strut front design is going to be some kind of a clunk or a noise, and 90% of the time that clunk or noise is going to come from the strut top mount. From the factory, it's a two-piece design. It has this rubber and metal top half that fits on top of the strut, and then you have this lower bearing. That's job is to rotate and locate. So what will happen, generally speaking, is this bearing will develop some play, and you get a lot of noise, usually over washboard surfaces where it's loaded and unloaded, or very, very tight, slow corners. There are some aftermarket upgrades, such as the 034 Motorsport Dynamic Plus kit, which is a fixed camber design, and others which are adjustable and solid aluminum. They each have their pluses and minuses, but if you're looking to improve the performance of the car and add some negative camber to the front of the car, there are some options out there for you. So when it comes to replacing these parts, it really depends on how you use the car and the type of streets that it sees. So generally, they will easily last 40 to 60,000 miles, sometimes maybe even 80 or 100. However, it is worth checking and replacing these sooner rather than later because they can lead to some issues in terms of alignment and handling performance. So at the front of the car, the strut is really the primary thing that you're looking at on a McPherson strut design. In front of me, we have a Bilstein B6, B8 style strut, and we have a Koni adjustable. Each version kind of has its own pluses and minuses. The factory strut from Volkswagen is a twin tube low pressure design, and you can very effectively and inexpensively replace that with a unit from Saks. It's going to meet very similar performance to the factory. It's pretty much what the car comes with. If, however, you're looking for a little better performance or you're looking to lower the car, options like these are advantageous. So the Bilstein is a monotube design. It is an inverted monotube, which is why this strut itself is so large right here. And you'll see that there's no room or ability to put this bump stop on the actual strut itself like you would use on the factory or the Koni. So this has an internal bump stop. These are rated for the Bilstein B6 for a stock ride height vehicle. The B8 is for a sport spring or a lowered vehicle. So the Koni strut here is a twin tube design, and it is adjustable for rebound damping. So depending upon your personal preference, the type of springs you have on the car or how you use your car, an OE replacement aftermarket type unit or one of these units from Bilstein or Koni could be a nice choice for you. There are also full coilover kits available, which will generally incorporate one variation of either of these struts and some means to fine-tune the ride height. Some of that's going to be for aesthetics and looks if you're really picky, or it can also be for performance when it comes to corner balancing a car and getting it ready for the track, or really just ultimately maximizing the handling capacity of the car. So when you're looking at the front strut, you have this tab here which is for connecting the sway bar end link. The sway bar end link is another possible source of noise on the front of the car, and this connects the strut to the front sway bar. You'll see it has these little ball joints, and these do wear over time. So when it comes to the sway bar end links, these factory units are pretty robust. They do tend to last a while, but as you're going up in mileage, somewhere around 60,000, maybe 70,000, it's probably worth replacing them with fresh units because they are going to have some pretty decent wear and tear at that point. So there are some aftermarket units available for these front sway bar end links, such as these adjustable units from 034. you'll notice that these have spherical ends, and it is adjustable to set the preload on the front bar. So if you're talking about maximizing your performance, if you have an upgraded aftermarket front sway bar, these are a really nice option. They do come with these little boots to help protect the sphericals, but these are going to make noise well before any factory units will. That's kind of a trade-off. You can service them to try to keep them up to date and everything like that, but that is a consideration when it comes to putting these on the car versus something that still has a ball joint with a sealed boot. So generally speaking, you don't need to replace the factory sway bar end link with an aftermarket performance unit when you lower the car. The relationship between the bar and the strut body itself does not really change all that much, and you're generally going to be in the window. If you're super slammed, yes, a shorter adjustable unit might be necessary, but it's not something that you absolutely have to have. And if you do require one, any good suspension that you buy is going to come with the parts that you need for that. On the front suspension of a McPherson strut car, you have a large spindle that we don't have on this table here that basically connects all of these components together. The lower front control arm is the other major component. So you have your spindle that bolts down here, and it bolts to the subframe front and rear here. The ball joint itself, its job is to connect to the spindle at the bottom there. And this does see a pretty reasonable amount of force put through it. It's obviously a very crucial component of the suspension design. So you do need to be very aware of these as you go up in mileage. Some common things to look for are going to be cracking and tearing of the boot itself. When that happens, it's going to be time to replace the ball joint. And generally speaking, if you're somewhere in the range of 80,000 miles, it's time to start looking at replacing these. They're quite robust from the factory. This same exact part is pretty much what comes on the Volkswagen GTI TCRs. So it's a really stout part. It's just very crucial. So if you were to have a failure there, you're going to have a bad time, basically. It could potentially lead to some kind of an accident or on-the-road issue. So you do need to be very diligent about the ball joint itself. So the control arms are stamped steel on the Mk7 GTI. They're pretty stout, robust. They don't really have any issues whatsoever, but they do have these rubber bushings. So the rubber bushings can develop play over time. They have these little gaps to help eliminate noise, vibration, and harshness and provide a better ride and less noise kind of in the cabin of the car. In the front, it's solid rubber, but these are a weak point when it comes to ultimate performance. So on this rear bushing here, this is the one you're going to usually see the issues with. You'll start to see cracking in the rubber around the actual mounting point there itself. So a little bit of cracking is not indicative of needing to be replaced, but it does mean that it's time to start keeping an eye on it and potentially replace this bushing. Now, if you need to replace both the bushings, sometimes it's cheaper and easier to replace the entire control arm, which comes preloaded with these parts, or you can choose to upgrade it to some kind of an aftermarket performance option. So from there, we have this PowerFlex bushing kit. And this bushing right here is obviously a solid poly unit, and this actually mounts and gets pressed down into the control arm there. And what this essentially is doing for you, it's going to remove some of the deflection under load while you're cornering and things like that, and give you sharper, better handling and better performance. Any of these modern polyurethane, high quality polyurethane units are going to last a pretty good long while, and the PowerFlex stuff is top notch for that. So some people may have experience with older polyurethane or lower quality polyurethane stuff that just sort of falls apart after a couple years, and that's not a problem you're going to have with these. So with this front bushing, you're generally not going to see as much wear and tear, and they last quite a long while, but that doesn't mean you can't upgrade or improve the performance of the car by replacing that. So we have a couple options here from PowerFlex. We have this kit here, which is a basic polyurethane front bushing insert kit. So that goes right there. And this is a standard kit, non-adjustable. It just removes some of the slop and offers better performance. But as we're talking about a lack of camber adjustment, there is this adjustable unit that is available from PowerFlex. You'll see here it has this offset hole for where the bolt goes through at the front mounting point there, and you can adjust to increase negative camber. Now, it is worth noting that you're adjusting more than just negative camber when you adjust this. You're adjusting roll center and caster. So this is not a perfect solution, but it is a fairly inexpensive and fairly easy to adjust option. So if you've got a point you're trying to hit, this might be a nice option. So one of the last components of the front suspension design, and this would be on any front suspension, not just a McPherson strut, is going to be your tie rod assembly. The tie rod assembly's job is to connect the steering rack to the spindle so you can steer the car. There's two primary components on that. You have your inner tie rod, which threads into the steering rack, and then you have your outer tie rod, which threads onto this to adjust your toe, and it goes into the spindle on the car. Of these two units, this outer tie rod sees the most wear and tear and the most abuse. Very similar to any other thing we've talked about here, where it's a sealed ball joint design. You want to look for cracking and tearing on that boot. So these are pretty robust parts. You'll probably need to think about replacing them somewhere around the 80 to 100,000 mile range. Again, it depends on how you drive the car, but this inner tie rod, for example, is a pretty stout unit. It's identical to the ones that's used on our GTI TCR race cars, and it does quite well. As you develop play in either of these parts, you may start to notice a little bit of vibration in the car or something like that through the steering wheel. So anytime that you are working on the front of the car and you're replacing the inner or the outer tie rod, it's usually a good idea to pick up a new tie rod boot. These do wear over time, they'll crack and get brittle, and they'll begin to let dirt in, and that could potentially shorten the life of those components. So whenever you're doing those services, it's a good idea to pick up a new one of these for a couple of bucks just to make sure everything is fresh. So now that we've covered the major components here, I'm going to pull the wheel off of this GTI here on the lift and show you how to inspect and diagnose some of the common problems that we just discussed with these components. So let's get to it. Now we've got the wheel off and we have access to the strut and the primary assembly on the front of the suspension. It's worth stating that this is a pretty brand new car. It's about a year old and only has 13,000 miles on it. So everything that we're looking at is still pretty fresh. So just kind of keep that in mind when it comes to actually comparing what you're seeing here in this video with something that's a little bit higher mileage that you might have. So what you have here is the primary strut. This is the main unit, I guess you could call it, on the front suspension here. And it's the front damper. On this, it goes down into the spindle and it has a pinch, there's a pinch bolt that holds it in there. Then you have your spring and then the strut shaft and then the strut mount that's all the way up top, mounted up inside here in the wheel well. It's also worth noting on this that this car does have H&R lowering springs on it. So these are not the factory springs, so it sits a little bit lower. When you are lowering the car, we didn't really talk about springs on the table, but it's ideal to uprate the struts and the shocks to go with a set of lowering springs for the best performance. This certainly looks very good, but if you're talking about ultimate ride and ultimate handling, the stock strut doesn't really have the ability to keep up with the H&R setup. One of the things you can do to try to diagnose an issue with the strut bearing, and this is a little bit rudimentary, but it is potentially useful, is to rotate the assembly in and then out to try to isolate any noise or any play that you might have at the top strut bearing. If it is there, you may be able to hear a little bit of noise, a little bit of clicking that is indicative of a problem, and then you can kind of go further into diagnosing it and possibly remove the strut to get that done. So when it comes to the sway bar end link, which is mounted here, the tab on the strut down to the sway bar, if there is a major failure where you have a boot torn or something like that, you're going to be able to visually see that. It's very difficult to determine how much wear and tear has gone into that component. So if this was really bad, we could try to rotate it around and rattle it around and actually get some movement out of it. And that would be an indication that it's obviously bad and obviously needs to be replaced. In order to really diagnose one that's kind of on the border that probably should be replaced but isn't obviously bad, you do need to counterhold with a triple square and a wrench and actually take the sway bar end link off and then check the movement on it there. Once you have the sway bar end link off and you're trying to check the movement, it'll be pretty obvious. If there's no resistance and it's really easy to move the popsicle, to move the ball joint, it's bad and needs to be replaced. It should be fairly stiff to actually try to move that. So here we are. We're still looking at the front suspension. We're underneath of the car now and we're looking at the left front side. There's a few key items here to look at in terms of wear and tear. The first is going to be the lower ball joint. The other is going to be the outer tie rod end. Now both of these items do have rubber boots on them, and you're going to want to inspect them to see if there's any tears or any leaks or anything like that. If the boot is torn, it definitely needs to be replaced. It may not have failed yet, but the boot being torn will allow the introduction of dirt and water and everything else into the joint, and it will begin to wear out. Initially, it will just have excessive play, but eventually it could make noise and cause alignment issues and handling problems and such. The ball joint's a very similar design. Again, you want to check the boot for any tears. and make sure that there's not any excessive play. It's a little bit hard to kind of get a pry bar in on either one of these. You can attempt to try to get in on the ball joint, but it's pretty difficult. And most of what you're going to do, you can kind of see that you can move the control arm, and it certainly moves the ball joint, but that's not really giving you an indication of play. The other end of the control arm here, you have your front rearward bushing and you have your front forward bushing. Now between these two, you can get a pry bar in there. That's really one of the only ways you can try to determine if there's an issue, because you cannot visually inspect these. So you'll note that on this one, even though this is pretty much a brand new car, you can get a decent amount of play in that rear bushing, and I'm not really putting that much effort into it. So I know that this is not bad because it only has 13,000 miles on it. So you can't really just simply go by putting a pry bar on it to check it while it's up in the air. You sometimes do need to go a little bit further in for diagnostic purposes. If your car is much higher on mileage, something in the 100,000 mile range, that's where you're going to start to look at those items as being a real possibility of needing to be replaced. If you're well under 100,000 miles, or like for this particular car, if I wanted to upgrade the handling, that's where you would want to install one of the upgraded bushings or an upgraded kit or something like that. Similarly at the front, you have a bushing there. Again, it's fully enclosed by the subframe, and you can get a pry bar in there, but as it is now, there's zero play on that. So again, it's very difficult to diagnose while it's up in the air, but it can give you a little bit of an idea. One thing you do want to always be careful of, whenever you are trying to pry on a suspension component, you do want to be wary of what contact points you're making and whether or not that item can really support the stress that you're putting on it, so you don't damage other components on the car while you're trying to diagnose something else. As mentioned, the subframe on this car can be moved in order to fine-tune or adjust the alignment specifications from the factory. So if you slide it left or right, you're adjusting the camber left or right, and if you slide it forward or backward, you're adjusting the caster. Now that makes it fairly easy to align, and it makes it fairly easy to produce for Volkswagen, but it does introduce some problems and some potential, I don't want to call it compromises, but it's a little bit of a compromise on performance, and I'll tell you why. So as I mentioned previously, virtually all the hardware on this setup are stretch bolts. So if this subframe ever was adjusted for an alignment or something like that, and they reused the stretch bolts, those bolts are not necessarily going to torque to the same specification, and you may not be able to get visual movement out of it, but you might have some noise, some creaking and things like that under transition. So whether that's stopping and starting the vehicle, turning left, turning right, things like that, you can get some noise out of it. So the problem is with these bolts, there are 4 altogether, is that they have to locate the subframe both horizontally and vertically. And that's kind of a lot for those bolts to be asked to do. So there are some aftermarket solutions. For example, from 034 Motorsport, they make a collar kit that inserts into the subframe and helps to support the bolt and locate the subframe on a horizontal plane. And what that does then is when you put the new bolts in, it not only locates the subframe for you, it allows the bolts to simply hold the subframe on a vertical plane because the collar is assisting on the horizontal plane. It's a very, very small, inexpensive, cheap part, but it does make for a really nice addition to most of these vehicles in terms of how they handle, how they feel, what the feedback is in the steering wheel. And if you are getting some clunking from the subframe, or if you're getting a clunking or creaking and you've been through everything and you can't figure out what it is, the subframe might be the issue, and a collar kit might help to alleviate that for you. On those 4 bolts, you have 2 at the rear. They're located here on this metal bracket, sort of near the exhaust downpipe bracket and bushings. So there's 2 there, and then you have 2 more that are up, located up through the control arm. So there's this hole in the control arm there that you basically use to access the bolt, and you can, there's one on each side there. So we haven't really gone into depth on the front sway bar on this car. They're pretty much trouble-free out of the box. The bushings do wear out eventually. You could probably, get 100,000 miles out of it easily, honestly more than that. However, it is a popular upgrade item. So if you're talking about upgrading the car for performance, upgrading the front sway bar, if you've already upgraded the rear, can be an addition to kind of increase the handling capacity of the car. There's a lot of opinion and a lot of options out there about running a stock front sway bar and an upgraded rear sway bar. What that really comes down to is the balance, and that's always a personal preference. for you, how you drive the car and what you want out of the car. So upgrading the front sway bar is potentially a nice option and something to look into depending upon how you use your vehicle. So one of the things you're going to need to do to try to determine if there's play on the inner tie rod is to put pressure back and forth, top and bottom, left and right, on the wheel while it is bolted to the car, but it is in the air. And what you're going to be checking for is to see if there's any excessive play within that system. If it is a left or right play, it could be the inner tie rod. And if it's up and down, it could be ball joint. If it's both, it could be wheel bearing, ball joint, tie rod. So there's a couple different things to look for, but essentially you don't want to have any play in that at all as you're putting pressure on it. So now that we've taken a look at the front suspension, let's head back over to the workbench. We'll take a look at the rear. Now, as I mentioned, the rear suspension on the Mk7 GTI is a multi-link and it is independent. So it's pretty trick and pretty high tech compared to what used to come on a lot of Volkswagens. When the multi-link design was introduced on the Mk5 GTI, it was kind of a game changer, and it's really what has made the modern GTIs so much better than a lot of the ones in the past in terms of their handling, their ride, and their performance. Now, being a multi-link, you've got a bunch of different pieces on the back. You have a tow arm, camber arms, trailing arms, etc. And I'm going to go over all that stuff when we're actually underneath of the car. So I have a little bit of a layout here, some parts to go over kind of the core fundamental aspects or the core fundamental parts, and then we'll go into further detail once we're underneath. So because of the design, you don't really see excessive wear on a lot of these parts compared to the front. Where the strut bearings in the front see a lot of use and abuse, the stuff in the rear, you can generally go a lot longer in terms of mileage and things like that before you see problems. But that's not to say there aren't some common issues. So the first is similar to the front of the suspension. The rear suspension has a top mount, and that's probably going to be one of the more common items that you're going to replace. It doesn't really have any moving parts. It doesn't have the same job to do as the front. And because of the way it's designed and the way that the load goes into the chassis in the rear, you might easily get 150,000 miles out of these depending upon how you drive the car. So you can generally get a good amount of mileage and a lot of use out of these. When they do go bad, you'll probably notice a rattle or something like that that's fairly high pitched. Now there are some upgraded options available in the market, like the 034 Motorsport Density Line unit, and this has a little bit higher density foam, so it's a little bit better control, a little more solid connection between the shock absorber and the chassis of the car, but it doesn't really have the same effect as upgrading the front. So probably the most common wear item on the rear outside of the top mount is going to be the shock absorber itself. Now the shock absorber is a standard non-load bearing unit, so it's not a strut. This is a factory replacement Sachs unit, and so it really doesn't see a lot of loading outside of normal use and abuse. So what you'll generally find on the rear shock is that when it goes bad, it'll probably start to make noise, squeak or squonk or squish, or I don't know, make some noise like that. There are some upgradable units available, so whereas you go with the Bilstein on the front, there's obviously Bilstein units available for the rear, and Koni, etc., etc. You'll notice that on the rear of the car, any aftermarket shock, whether it's a Bilstein or it's a Koni or something like that, is going to have a separate bump stop. They don't use an internal bump stop like they do on a front strut on the Bilstein. And it does come complete as a unit with the bump stop and the dust boot. So generally when you're replacing a shock absorber, I recommend going with a new bump stop unit, because these do get used quite a bit, especially as you load the car and things like that with heavier weights and whatnot. And usually it's a good idea to go with new top mounts just to make sure everything's fresh when you're doing rear shock absorbers. So as I said, there are 4 individual links on each side of the rear suspension. So there's a lot of bushings that are in those. Those bushings do see a decent amount of loading, and that's probably going to be really your only wear point on the rear suspension for the most part, outside of the shock absorber and the shock mounts. There are, however, some nice upgrades available. So similar to the front, where you have some performance aftermarket options to increase performance and handling, you have the same on the rear. So you have these 034 Motorsport billet adjustable camber arms, and what this essentially does is allows you to a little bit easier time fine-tuning the camber at the rear of the car, and a little bit better connection because they have these uprated rubber bushings, which are stronger than the factory units. Likewise, we have a factory trailing arm here. This one is a Mile unit, and you can see this rear bushing here has those big air gaps, just like the bushing on the front. So you're going to get a lot of play and wear and tear. And again, that bushing's pretty stout. It holds up well over time in the factory unit. but you can upgrade them for better performance. So we have these PowerFlex bushings, which is an insert unit, very similar design to what you see at the front. And with this, you're gonna get better control, you're gonna get less movement, better alignment specs in the rear, especially as you load the car and as you're driving in a more sporty manner. These can be a little bit of a bear to install sometimes, so you definitely wanna have press. But they are a simple and easy way for the most part to increase the handling and the performance without really changing too much at the rear of the car. And then lastly, we have our sway bar end links. Now again, these are similar to the front in that you have an OE and aftermarket options, but these are obviously quite a bit shorter. So our factory sway bar end link is a composite design. It does have a ball joint with a boot. So just like any of the stuff we've discussed where it has a boot and it's a sealed ball joint, when you see this starting to crack, that's gonna be a good indication that it needs to be replaced. When you start to get a little too much movement, again, that's going to be indication that they need to be replaced. Very similar to the front, when these start to develop some play, you are going to get a little bit of noise usually, or a little bit of rattling, which is not all that uncommon. So there are upgraded options. You can see we have the 034 Motorsport billet design, and this is essentially what you would use to match up to the adjustable fronts. This again is solid billet aluminum, just like the front, and it has these spherical ends. There are no means to seal up these spherical bearings, so these are going to make noise on some vehicles after a certain amount of time. That's kind of the name of the game again. If you're talking about ultimate performance, this does provide a much more positive connection between the rear sway bar and the rear control arm, where it actually makes a connection. So one of the final things that I'm going to touch on, and this primarily goes for the rear suspension, but it goes for the front as well, is when it comes to hardware and replacing any of these parts. So obviously you've got a lot of major connections here between the body of the car, the subframe of the car, and the spindle or various suspension components. Virtually every bolt on the rear of the suspension on a Volkswagen is what's called a torque to yield bolt or a stretch bolt, which means it needs to be replaced every single time it is loosened. You cannot really safely reuse those. They're not designed to be reused. They are literally designed to stretch, and they are not going to be able to be torqued the same amount and safely hold the same loads as a brand new bolt would. We do offer hardware kits for the vast majority of these parts. So when you are replacing, say, these control arm bushings or something like that, you need to use new hardware every single time. There is one exception to that, and that is on the factory toe and camber adjustment bolts. Those have an eccentric on it so that they can be adjusted, and you can adjust your toe and you can adjust your camber. And on those, you are supposed to replace the nut every single time. But the bolt itself on those two positions are not a replaceable part, or you don't have to replace them all the time. They do rust pretty badly in a lot of places, so putting fresh stuff in there is not the worst thing in the world. So now that we've taken a look at some of the major components of the rear suspension of the Mk7 GTI, let's get back underneath of the car and I'll go over how to inspect and diagnose some of the more common problems that we'll find. So here we are at the back of the GTI, and we're looking mainly at the brake and the shock absorber here. Now the vast majority of what you're going to be looking at the rear of this car are actually going to be underneath. We're going to go under there in a minute, but for right now we're just going to concentrate on what's up front here. So the shock absorber, as you can see, is mounted on the rear. It has a couple of bolts that hold it up into the body of the car, and then the bottom is connected by simply one bolt to the control arm. So it is very, very easy to service. You will note that there is a dust cover and there is a bump stop under the dust cover, like what we covered on the workbench. However, you'll see on this particular example, I can't see any of the shock absorber. So if I'm looking for signs of a failed shock here, it would have to strictly be in the sense of looking at the amount of oil that might be down on the shock body or something like that. You're looking essentially for the same failure points you would on the front strut. If it is leaking an excessive amount of oil out of the shock absorber, you're probably losing damping performance. You may be getting a little bit of bouncing, a little bit of uneven handling or instability, especially at high speeds. One thing you will not be able to see here, which you would be able to see at the front, is that if the piston itself is beginning to show wear, you'll be able to see that. And that might not actually be indicative of the shock having failed, but it is a sign that there's a good amount of wear that's gone on. The hardened chromed plating that goes on top of that shock piston is very tough stuff. So if you're seeing that wear off, chances are the shocks are ready for replacement sooner rather than later. And if they're not leaking yet, they
probably will be soon. One really quick note, just to kind of put it out there. This car does have spacers on both the front and the rear, and they're still on the brake disc here. So if you pull everything apart and you don't see this thing here looking exactly the same, it's because I have spacers on this car. As I mentioned, in order to get really a full view of the rear suspension on the GTI, we're gonna go raise the car up, we'll go underneath, and I'll be able to show a little bit more detail about the trailing arm, tow arm, the camber arm, and the front tie rod, as well as the rest of the rear suspension. So here we are underneath of the left rear of the car, and we're gonna go over the multi-link suspension that's found on this Mk7 Volkswagen GTI. So there's a couple kind of key components that you're gonna see here. There's this primary large arm here, which is the tow arm at the back. You have your primary trailing arm, which connects the subframe of the car back to the spindle. And then you have two tow arms, or two tie rods, I should say. So you have the lower tie rod, which is a fixed location and no adjustment points. And then you have the upper camber arm, which is obviously what the name camber arm implies. It adjusts the camber on the rear suspension. So when we were talking about the adjustable 034 Motorsport camber arms, that goes up at the top there. Because you have so many different components, you do have a good number of bushings back here that you'll need to check for play as the mileage goes up. You'll see that similar to the rear, the front rearward control arm, on the front suspension, the trailing arm bushing here on the rear trailing arm where it actually joins the cup or it mounts into the chassis has a decent amount of play from the factory. So even on this car, if I put a pry bar in there and try to put a little force on it, it's gonna move. So again, you really need to pay attention to the amount of movement that you're getting if you are going to use a pry bar on that particular unit to see how much play you're getting. From there, you have your adjustment points here for tow. So there's the concentric. This is what's adjusted to adjust the tow on the rear suspension. And then likewise, all the way up top, it's a little bit hard to see, but that's where your camber adjustment's going to be. So there are bushings at the ends of each of these, and as the mileage goes up again, you're going to want to try to use a pry bar to get in there to see how much movement you can get. With this thing being brand new, it's pretty tight and I'm not really seeing any movement here, but you would start to look for some signs of cracking or some kind of fatigue or something like that to go along with that extra play. It is worth noting that if you are working on the rear suspension, you need to be careful of the ride height sensor here. This little plastic arm connects to the ride height sensor, which is used for primarily headlight leveling, but you do need to be wary of the level sensor here at the rear of the car. They are pretty delicate and they can be quite expensive, so you want to make sure you disconnect those anytime you're working on the rear suspension, pulling this control arm down or anything like that. So one of the features of this particular suspension design that you'll see, and this is very common on almost any modern vehicle because of packaging concerns, is that this has a divorced spring setup, which means virtually that this spring is separate here and sits down in the actual control arm, and it sits inboard of where the shock absorber is. That does affect the geometry of the suspension a little bit in terms of the lever arm that's kind of being, and that's being activated against the spring. So the force acting on the shock is not identical to the force acting on the spring. So that's one of the reasons that you see our TCRs, for example, have a true coilover setup, because that's more accurate. However, for 99.9% of people, street use, even track use, for most people, maintaining the divorced spring setup is totally fine and not really an issue. It does make it a little bit easier to work on, to be honest with you. This is a super quick and easy setup if you're replacing the shock absorbers or the springs, or the shock absorber mounts, which is 99% of the time what you're going to be doing back here. It's a very, very simple job and very easy to do. Now, as I mentioned, all these bolts, all these points of hardware are torque to yield stretch bolts, so you do need to make sure you purchase the replacements when you're doing the installations. Finally, it's a little bit hard to see here, but the sway bar end links sit down in the control arm here and connect to the sway bar, which is just above my head. Once again, there are bushings, rubber bushings on those. Similar to the front, you're really going to need to check the boot to see if the boot is torn on the upper part, or you can try and get a pry bar in here on the bottom to see if there's any play on it. More than likely, like the front, you're going to have to disconnect it in order to properly check the ball joint for the amount of play that it has and to see if that's failed. So although the bushings that you have here on these various control arms and these tie rods are, there's a lot of those bushings there, and although they're fairly long wearing compared to the front. Some of these components can be a little bit delicate. So if you were to ever get into an accident or something like that, these are generally designed to give and would be one of those items that you'd need to look at and inspect in the event of tapping a curb or something along those lines. Of all the bushings on this particular setup, in terms of the ones that take really the most wear, tear, use, and abuse, you're gonna be looking at your primary trailing arm bushing, and then the upper outer on the camber arm seems to take a little bit more of a hit and develop a little bit more play than some of the other ones. You also do have to be careful with the bushing here in the toe arm, because as you're working on the suspension, you are going to be putting some different loads and deflection into that, and you don't want to rotate it or you don't want to move it beyond its capacity and cause some extra damage to it while you're working on it. One of the more popular upgrades for the Mk7 GTI in terms of suspension is the rear sway bar. Now, this is a pretty service-free unit from the factory. You could easily get 100,000 or more miles out of it without any issues whatsoever. The sway bar end links, obviously, as we've talked about, are an item that might wear out a little bit more quickly than that, but the bar itself is pretty sturdy. However, replacing the rear sway bar with an uprated unit is going to provide you with a little bit sharper handling and better performance out of the car. It's also a very easy upgrade to do. So if you are in the back and doing a couple of service items like replacing the end links or maybe some bushings or a shock absorber, throwing a rear sway bar on there could improve the handling and performance without really too much extra effort. You know, as I've said before, the rear of the suspension on this car is pretty service-free compared to the front. You know, outside of replacing the shock absorber itself or the shock absorber top mount, you're really going to be looking at bushings and trying to make sure that you're replacing those or servicing those whenever they need to be. A lot of that is going to come down to you feeling the car out while you're driving on the highway. Generally, as the bushings start to have a little bit more play and they get a little bit more wear, you're going to notice a little bit of instability or a little bit of unstable characteristics on the highway. It may start to be a little bit more unpredictable while you're driving in terms of, you know, loading into a corner or something like that. But ultimately, you just have to use your eyes and ears and really kind of go over everything as closely as you can. You know, with this car being so new, I can't really show you anything that's actually failed or needs to be replaced. So yeah, ultimately, you just kind of need to use your eyes and ears as best you can. And if you think there is a problem or you're noticing something that's specifically outside of the range of that shock or the shock mount, just be diligent in how you check the bushings and systematic, you know, from one item to the other. So that about wraps it up underneath here. I'll get the car put back together and then we'll finish up over on the workbench. So that about wraps things up. Hopefully I've given you a little bit of insight into the suspension on the Mk7 GTI and haven't scared you away too much from tackling any projects or handling any maintenance on your own. All in all, it's a really robust design, holds up really, really well under a wide variety of use. So, you know, if you have any questions or if there's anything that you'd like to see a little bit more of, drop them in the comments below. And of course, please like and subscribe.